Shalom. Today's daf yomi is Zevachim daf Kuf Yud Aleph Zevachim 111, and we're going to start 4 lines from the bottom on Kuf Yud Amud Beis on 110b. Says the Gemara Tan Rabbanan, the Brisa teaches, Amanasech Shloshes Lugan Mayim B'Chag. If somebody does a libation of 3 lugan of water on the holiday of Sukkot, Bachutz, he does it outside the temple, he's chayiv. He's going to be liable. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says, Omer Imon L'Shem Chag chayiv. He says if it was filled up for the purpose of the Chag, then he's going to be liable. So the Tanakhama says, if you do a libation of 3 lugan of water on Sukkot, you're liable. And Rabbi Eliezer's statement is, if you filled it up for the purpose of the holiday, you're liable. These are opaque statements. We're not sure what they mean. So the Gemara wants to know, my benayo, what are they stating? What's going on here? The my kamifalge, Rashi says, what are they arguing about? Or my ka'asi Rabbi Eliezer, what's Rabbi Eliezer teaching us? So the Gemara says that it's as follows. Amar B'Nachman bar Yitzchak b'yesh shiur b'mayim kamifalge. They're arguing about a case about whether or not there is a shiur, there is a amount in the water. Let's look at what Rashi says. The Tanakhama is of the position that if you're menasech 3 lugan of water, you're liable. And also, if you do more than 3 lugan, you're liable. Yesh b'klal masayim maneh means included within 200 is 100. And even though you put it in a very large utensil, it's going to consecrate it, because we're going to see there's no specific amount for the water on the festival. There's no upper limit. And so therefore, even if you did more than 3 lugan, even though it says, it means even if you did more than 3 lugan, you're liable. Rabbi Eliezer comes to teach us, no, it's only, he says, Hu Shamil Hashem Chag, meaning to say, that is only if you did 3 lugan and that's it. As it states, it only holds 3 lugan. But if you put it in something that's more than 3 lugan, then it wasn't consecrated by the utensil, because it's not the appropriate amount. And so therefore the Klisheris didn't sanctify it. So basically they're arguing about a case where, let's say you filled it up in a utensil that could hold more than 3 lugan. Then Rabbi Eliezer says it's not consecrated, and the Chachamim say it's even consecrated. Rav Papa says on the top of 111a, Bekirbo Nisachem B'Midbar Kamiflagi. Rav Papa says they're arguing about a case where whether or not the Nisachem were brought in the wilderness. The Nisachem are the libations. And what's going on here? So we have to look at, it's a very long Rashi, because the Gemara is missing a lot of words here to educate us. So Rashi says, both of them say that you have to accept the principle. Both opinions are that there is an exact amount for the water above. And if you fill it up more, it wasn't consecrated. So if it was a utensil bigger than 3 lugan, it wasn't consecrated. That's the first point. The Tanakhama says, that you're liable if you bring this outside the courtyard of the temple. He says, you don't require it at all to have nisachim in the utensil in order to be liable b'chutz, because he says, so he says you don't require it to be done in order to be liable. You don't require it that it be consecrated in the utensil. Why? Because the Tanakhama is on the position that when they brought the nisachim in the wilderness, it was done in the wilderness for all 40 years. And so therefore, when it says that when you come into the land, which is in the parasha of Nisachim and parasha Slach, that's to teach us that the 7 years of the conquering of the land and the 7 years of the dividing of the land, when the Jewish people were in Gilgal, and that's to teach us about that area. And the bamos were allowed, that each person had a private altar during that period. So they required to have the nisachim, because by the communal bamos, there was not required to have this. By the communal bamos, it wasn't required to teach us this idea, because they already had the bamos they already had the Nesachim in the wilderness. So it was to teach us about the private bamos. And so therefore, wait, what's the first thing we said? The first thing we said is they're not arguing about the upper limit. Everybody says if it was an upper limit, if it was above 3 lugan, it wouldn't be good. So they're arguing about, the Tanna Kama says you're liable because it says you don't need a kli outside. The reason why you don't need a kli outside is because the Nesachim were brought even when there were private bamos, private altars. And so, and there was no klisharis. So therefore, if you brought it outside, even without a klisharis, you're going to be liable. Whereas Rebbe Lezer says they didn't bring it in the wilderness. And then when it says Bias Aretz, that means after they conquer the land. And there was a Mishkan Shiloh. And that's where you're liable. And so therefore, all the 40 years in the wilderness, they didn't bring it. So therefore, it requires a Kli Sharis. So if you brought it outside without the Kli Sharis, then it's going to be. And so therefore, if you brought it without a Kli Sharis, you're not going to be liable for it, according to Rabbi Eliezer. So, and that's what we're saying. Basically, the one who says Kedushas Kli b'Nesachim, the one who says you require a utensil, is going to say they didn't bring the Nesachim in the wilderness. And Ravina says, that they're arguing about whether or not you learn the amount of Nisuch HaMayim of the libation of the water from the libation of the wine. So let's see what Rashi says here. Everybody's at the position that they brought the Nesachim in the wilderness. And everybody's at the position now when it says when you come into the land, it refers to a private altar that you brought the Bamas on that. And that everybody therefore says that you can bring it on the Bama without consecrating it. Nevertheless, this idea of the Nesachim, we only find on a private altar, we only find that with Nisuch Hayayim, but not with Nisuch Hamayim, with a wine libation, but not the water libation, because the wine libation was a communal obligation, and was only brought on the carbon seber with the Kli Sharis. And so this is their argument. The Tanna Kama's position is we learn Nisuch Hamayim from Nisuch Hayayim. So we compare them, and therefore we're going to say you're liable b'chutz. You're liable outside, even without a utensil. Whereas Rebbe Lezer's of the petition, we don't learn it. And so therefore, and when you're liable for Nisuch Hayayim, that's without a utensil. But with Nisuch Hamayim, you're only going to be liable with a utensil. So the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, so the Gemara says, let's cite a price, and that supports it. If you do a libation of 3 lugan of wine, you're liable outside the courtyard. Whereas Rabbi Lezer Shimon Omer, that's only if you consecrated it. What's the distinction? The distinction between them is bebeirutze midos ika. So the distinction between them is the fizz that's on top of the wine barrel. The both of them say that Nisuch Hayayim requires sanctification, but the rabbis are the position that the fizz was consecrated, and therefore you're going to be liable. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says that it wasn't consecrated, and so therefore it wasn't consecrated, this fizz, because it wasn't in the utensil, so therefore you're not going to be liable. Rabba Breder Rabba Amar Kirbo Nesachim B'Bama Ika Benayu. Whereas Rabba, the son of Rabba, says that they're arguing about the case of whether or not they brought the Nesachim in the Bama. That the Tanna Kama does not require Kedushas Kli. He doesn't require it. And so therefore, according to the Tanna Kama, they brought the Nesachim in the wilderness. Therefore, you don't require a utensil. They brought it, and so therefore you don't require a utensil. Whereas according to Rabbi Lezer Shimon, they did not bring it, and so therefore you require a utensil. And it's the same dispute as the other Tanaim. Titania, Bamas Yachid, Eina Tzricha Nesachim, Divrei Rebbe. That Rebbe was in a position that the individual Bamos did not require the libations. Whereas the Chachamim Omrim Te'una Nesachim. It does require. Bahani tanai kahani tanai. And it's like the following dispute. Tanya kitavo. When it says when you come into the land, you should bring in a nesachim. Atina nesachim b'bama gadol. That's to require nesachim on the bama gadol. The bama gadol here is that the communal altars, they would require it. Oh, Eno, I feel bama katana. Maybe it's also required by an individual offering. Kishuomer, our eretz mushvos itchem asharninu stein lachem. Our bama no hagets lekochem. The pasuk is referring to a bama that applies to all of them. Akas medaba. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Whereas Rabbi Kiva says kitavo at ino nesachem bebama. When it says you come to the land to require nesachem bebama katana akas medaba. Even on an individual altar. I told Mera Obama Katano, we know Obama Gdol is an individual or even a communal one. Mera Arts most Techem. So it says into your land, Hari Bama no Haggis Bechol Moshvos. It's a Bama that applies to all the land. Tim Salomer with Rabbi Shmuel, so it proves that according to Rabbi Shmuel, who care for Nesachim Bamidbar, they didn't bring the Nesachim in the wilderness. Or Rabbi Kiva, care for Nesachim Bamidbar. According to Rabbi Kiva, they brought in the wilderness. Rabbi Nechemia says the Shiari Adam Shekrim B'chutz Chayiv. If you poured the part of the blood, the leftover, which was supposed to be poured on the base of the altar, if you poured that outside on the altar, you're going to be liable. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Tana Rabbi Nechemia, Kedivrei Omer Shirai Ma'akman. So Rabbi Nechemia is like the one who says that this part is essential, because otherwise, why would you be liable? So Meisvei Rabbi Nechemia Omer Shiari Adam Shekrim B'chutz Chayiv. So the Bryce, we contradictory Bryce. Nehemiah says that the Shiari Adam that you brought outside, you're liable. So I'm Rabbi Akiva, Velo Shiari Adam, Shiari Mitzvahim. So Rabbi Akiva says, but this remnants, so Rabbi Akiva responds that the Shiari Adam, they're the remnants of the mitzvah, meaning to say it's not essential, it's just a mitzvah. So he says, Rabbi Akiva says, he says the limbs and the fats, the Ivarim and the Pedarim, the limbs and the fats, which will show you're liable. Shein Shiari mitzvah. They're also just a Shiari mitzvah, meaning to say it's not essential. Only the blood is essential for a kapara. And if you bring them outside, you're liable. Don't compare the Ivarim and Pedarim, which are the beginning of the Avoda, and therefore we're more likely to be required than the Shiari Adam, which is not the beginning of the Avoda. And if Rabbi Nechemia really is at the position that it's essential, he should say that this blood is also essential. From the fact that wasn't his response, we see Rabbi Nechemia doesn't hold it's essential. Mar says Tiyufta, it's really a refutation of Rabbi Yochanan. And now that Rav Ada bar Abba said this whole dispute, whether pouring the blood is essential, is only by the inner chatas, i.e., the inner chatas that we discussed about, but the shiur mechatzionim, but the outer chatas, everybody says they're not essential. When Rabbi Nechemia says that you're chayev, he's only referring to the inner chatas. But the brayso which says, meaning to say, it's not necessarily a refutation of Rabbi Yochanan. You could say it's referring to two different types of chatas. By the inner chatas, there it's liable, and by the outer chatas, we would say that's where Rabbi Nechemia would say you're not chayiv. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi," namely, no. If it's the case that we're talking about the inner chatas, Rabbi Nechemia could have said to Rabbi Akiva, "Ki amri ana b'pnimiyim." I was referring to the inner one, but he didn't give that answer. Hello, it's Dvarav to Rabbi Akiva Kamar. So we say Rabbi Nechemia wasn't talking about the inner chatas, but he was only responding to the words of Rabbi Akiva. But he himself says that the blood of both are ma'akev. So Rabbi Yochanan is correct. Okay, so now we're up to the next Mishnah. It says the Mishnah, Hamoik esa of bifnim ve'ela b'chutz. So let's say somebody you do malika on the bird inside the courtyard. The malika is the way you kill the bird with your thumb. Ve'ela b'chutz, and you bring it up as a mizbeach on this korban outside. you're chayiv, you're liable. But malach b'chutz ve'ela b'chutz. But if you just did this malika outside of the base of mintash, you're supposed to do a shlita on the bird. So if you did a malika outside and you brought it up, you're pater because it's not a kosher animal. Also, if you slaughter the animal inside and you brought it up outside, you're pater because that's not the way to bring a korban. Shacha b'chutz ve'ela. Let's say you slaughtered it outside and you brought it up outside, chayiv. Then you're liable, even for the Allah, because shlita that was specifically, Rashi says, included, shlita of a bird was specifically included by the Torah. Maya asher yishlat v'Allah. So now I'm come on. We said this earlier back in our Gemara. Nimtza derech hachshir b'fnim peturo. B'chutz. Derech hachshir b'chutz peturo b'fnim. So the way in which you would sanctify it if you're in the temple is what would exempt, slaughter it inside the temple is what would exempt you outside, and the way in which you would disqualify it inside, the way in which you would make it kosher outside will exempt you inside. Rabbi Shimon Omer kol shechayaven olav b'chutz chayaven al kayotze b'fnim. So Rabbi Shimon says whatever you're liable for, if you do it outside, you're liable in a similar way if you do it inside. So if you brought it up outside, with the exception of with the exception of one who slaughters it inside and brings it up as an offering outside. So the Gemara says, why is this hayach shero? Why does it say in the Mishnah? The Gemara challenges the language of the Mishnah. Hayach shero is the shchita outside. It's validity chiyuvahu. It's chiyuv, because that's where. You see, that's not the shlita outside. It's chiyuv. So the Gemara says, yeah, change the language. Tanya chiyuv. So what is Rabbi Shimon arguing about? What is Rabbi Shimon arguing about? When Rabbi Shimon says kol shechayavin al b'chutz chayavin al kiyotzi bo b'fnim she'ela b'chutz chutz min hashocha b'fnim umala b'chutz. What's he referring to? If you say he's referring to the first clause. Where it says Hamolik of Bifnim, that if you did the Malika inside and then you brought it up outside Ve'ela B'chutz Chayev, but if you're Malik B'chutz Ve'ela B'chutz Potter, the Amalek Rabbi Shimon says just like if you did this inside, if you did the Malika inside, you're liable B'chutz Nami M'chayev. Also, if you did the Malika outside, you're Chayev. So if that's the case, why did it say Kol Shechayavin or B'chutz? Why did it say anything which you're liable outside? He should say kol shechayav no'av bifnimi, by the way. He should say anything which you're liable for inside. So it must be, what is Rabbi Shimon saying? Anything which in chutz you're not liable, bifnim nami lo, you're not liable for the inside. So meaning to say, just like if you did malika on the bird outside, you're not chayev. So too, if you do malika inside, and then the bird comes outside, you're not liable. Hi, kol she'en chayavin olav b'chutz mibalei. Just say anything that you're not liable for chutz. So, not kol she'chayavin olav b'chutz, kol she'en chayavin. Ela seifa kai. So Rabbi Shimon must be referring to the seifa, where it says, the second clause, where it says, hashochet b'fnim, hashochet of b'fnim, ve'ela b'chutz pater, where it says, if you slaughter a bird inside, and you bring it up outside, you are exempt. But if you slaughter it outside and you bring it up outside, then you're going to be liable. And there Rabbi Shimon saying, just like you're not liable for slaughtering the animal inside and bring it outside, so too if you did it outside. If that's the case, it should have said kol she'ein chayavin mibalei. It should have said anything which you're not liable. So Ella must be a case where just like outside you're liable, inside you're also liable. If that's the case, but it can't be, because it says with the exception of something that's slaughtered inside, that you bring it up outside. And that's just like with the exception of somebody who slaughtered inside and brings it up outside, where he specifically says, that's not the case. That's excluded. So Amar Zeiri, so what's he referring to? Shchitas behema b'layla ikabenav. They were arguing about a case of where he slaughtered the animal at night. This is what Rabbi Shimon says. That this is what the Mishnah said. If you slaughter an animal inside at night and you brought it up outside, you're exempt. Shacha b'chutz b'layla. But if you slaughtered it at night, shacha b'chutz b'layla v'ela b'chutz, chayiv. Rabbi Shimon says, "Kol shechayav v'ela b'chutz, chayiv and al kiyotze b'fnim v'ela b'chutz." Rabbi Shimon says, anything which you are chayiv for bringing up outside, you're going to be liable. A similar case for inside. If you brought it outside, chutz min hashochet ol b'fnim v'ela b'chutz. That's this theory's explanation. Rava says, "Ka'bala b'kli choli kabenav." They're arguing about a case of where you receive the blood in a non-sacred utensil. If you receive it in a non-sacred utensil and bring it up outside, you're exempt. But if you receive it outside and bring it up outside, you're liable. Or as Rabbi Shimon says, you would also be liable inside if you did it inside. With the exception of the bird. So the Gemara says, "Hashti the Tani Avodah Shmuel Bar Yitzchak." Now that the father Shmuel Bar Yitzchak taught that if you kill the bird inside through malika and then you bring it up outside, you're liable. But if you do this outside, you're exempt. Rabbi Shimon Mechayev, Rabbi Shimon Hasam Klai. We see Rabbi Shimon is referring to the first clause, and we have to change the text. Tani Kol Shechayav Elav Bifnim Ve'ela B'chutz Chayav Elav. Anything which you're liable for inside, and then you bring it outside, you're going to be liable if you do it all outside. And that's obviously we're going to go over this tomorrow much slower, much more carefully. But that is today's the daf for Shabbos Kodesh. Baruch Hashem. Thank you.